Later On might be one of those rare albums whose title describes its position in the artist's catalog. Led Zeppelin and Slipknot released some more famous examples of this, using what else but numbers in the titles. While it may be trickier to use words, I've come to expect nothing less from Jandek on his third album. Though he was still far enough underground to hit Earth's mantle, a follow up to 6 and 6 was no easy feat, because it was the second half of a legendary duo. The title, Later On, could act as a segue, indicating a new direction in Jandek's work. It was still 5 years before traditionally tuned guitars would be heard on his albums, but that left a plethora of other obscure options. As mentioned in the John Trube interview, the tuning was always deliberate. Further examination would prove the guitar couldn't be that way by accident. The interview was in 1985, but I think Later On was already strong evidence against the untuned argument. Originally, the guitar strings were tuned to E, A, and D to varying degrees of microtonality, making it very hard to identify a particular chord. But as soon as Later On begins, you can tell that's been toned down a bit, no pun intended. If you can mess around with an A-sharp fifth chord, these songs are not hard to cover. However, the tuning is still very much Jandek's. The low string is G-sharp, adding a bluesy element to his playing, while the high string preserves the dissonance from before. With a more deliberate tuning, I describe this album as moderate Jandek, since fans can enjoy it when they're not feeling hardcore, but still not up for You Walk Alone. The simplified lyrics on Later On are also a departure from his earlier work, and right off the bat, Your Condition makes no secret of this. Like with Naked in the Afternoon, Jandek uses repetition to get his point across, but now it's limited to only one sentence. You might just see this as a new kind of introduction, but 2 tracks later, Just Whisper features a similar structure, just with a minor change in the second half. Meanwhile, John Came and The Second End get their point across with a mere 2 lines. To be fair, a song doesn't need to say much to serve its purpose. Just listen to Surfin' Bird or Tub Thumping. But when Jandek just lets his words marinate like this, you'd better get comfortable with that guitar chord. Hands down, the biggest innovation on Later On is a new instrument. Guitar and vocals is Jandek's most iconic approach, but his songs come in many different forms, a few recent additions being harpsichord and harmonium. However, this can all be traced back to 1981, with the ear-splitting squeal of a harmonica. It keeps Your Condition interesting, since the lyrics don't, but it practically steals the show 3 tracks later on Oh Jenny. Once you turn up the volume for this quiet song, the harmonica barges in, almost like a dog whistle. It sounded more bluesy before, but surprisingly, it suits the haunting dissonance going on here. What's even more interesting about Oh Jenny is that it might be a 2-part song. Until Then comprises the second half, but doesn't mention Jenny by name. This is because the first half was a direct apology, while the second is the narrator's inner thoughts, which sound a lot like denial. Even if this isn't what Jandek was going for, these simple songs sound more complete when played consecutively, and the staccato on Until Then is a nice contrast with the gentleness from before. While the track list of Later On is longer than its precursors, there are only 3 Jandek songs I consider essential here, and they seem to be about people he knows. After you're reminded of Your Condition a dozen times, you're treated to the brooding atmosphere of What Did I Hear? As the victim of some con man, the narrator shows that he has caught on to the scheme, but wonders how he fell for it in the first place. What baffles me is that the con man said he would do away with today, only for the narrator to realize days are just illusions. That's a profound thought, but it's unclear how it came about. I'm guessing the narrator met with a sneaky financial planner, since doing away with today could mean looking years into the future of your bank account. What's also baffling is that there's a pause in one of the lyrics, while Jandek just strums for 30 seconds. Maybe he lost his train of thought, but this part definitely adds a bit of suspense. Halfway through the record is The Janitor, my first taste of the album. On this fan favorite, Jandek roasts his friend for ironically being a slob, despite cleaning up after others.
You should take more care. The way you fix your hair. It's enough to make me sick.
The song is clear and direct, except for the part about living more naturally. Perhaps the janitor ought to find messier work, like on an oil rig? Regardless, this is a solid mid-paced track, where Jandek projects his voice well. Just be prepared for 45 seconds of strumming at the end. The last essential song is quieter, but not on the level of What Did I Hear? Jackson's Gone Down the Mississippi seems like the precursor to the River to Madrid phase of the mid-80s, but with a more definite story. This Jackson fellow begins his journey by floating, redoubles his efforts when faced with the ocean, and eventually must adapt to an unfamiliar land. However, the real destination of the journey seems to be a spiritual awakening, with Jackson letting some kind of hand guide him the rest of the way.
Now, Jackson, look to the skies. There's a reason for your eyes.
The gradual flow of the lyrics is very fitting for a story of this magnitude. As the penultimate track, I deem Jackson the proper ending of the record, as the finale doesn't have nearly as much to say. Your opinion of Later On will depend on how you listen to your albums. If you start with the tracks I mentioned, there's a chance you'll keep skipping over the rest. With my collection, I can be guilty of the same thing. I think Later On is best enjoyed the old-fashioned way, start to finish, because it adds more context to the unessential songs. Just Whisper is mostly saying walking down a road, moving down a road, but it's a decent transition to the Jenny songs. Not much is said on The Second End, but at least it sounds like the words of Jackson's awakening. As a Jandek album, its lyrics are still vague as ever, but hearing them all consecutively makes it fun to interpret, almost like a treasure map. Conversely, you can hear the previous records on shuffle, and they'll make just as much sense. For Later On, differences like this are what make the appeal so enduring. Hearing it for the first time, diversity may not be the first thing that comes to mind, but it did start the trend toward a more diverse catalog. For that reason, it deserves my respect. Play it on a long drive up a straight highway, and it'll earn yours.